Okay, welcome back, everyone. Today we have Professor Mark Thornton lecturing with us on money. Professor Thornton is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He's an author, economist, and podcaster. So, thank you, Mark, again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
My pleasure. It's great to be with you all today. I wish I could be out there with you in person. I would absolutely love that. Um, and I was introduced as a podcaster, and my Minor Issues podcast, MINOR, um, very often is on timely subjects related to money. And so I would encourage you to check that out. It comes out every Saturday morning, and it's a 8 to 10 minute look on something that isn't in the news or isn't in the news from an Austrian perspective. And of course, Karl Menger was the father of Austrian economics and really the foundational teacher of Mises and Hayek and Bombavrik. And so I try to reflect that in an up to date fashion. And so I would encourage you all to take a look at that. There's really no
Mark,
topic.
sorry to interrupt you. Can I request to turn your camera on so we can see you?
Okay.
Okay. If you want to, or whatever you're comfortable with.
No, no.
That's okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yes. There you go. Thank you.
I thought it was live. I'm sorry. Um, yes. Uh, yeah, there's no topic that's more important from an Austrian perspective than money. And actually, Karl Menger, one of his most important articles is on the origin of money. And I want to begin today by discussing that because that really sets the groundwork for everything that's important about money and all of the differences between the Austrian school's approach to money and the mainstream approach. And you might think that there's a great deal in common between the mainstream and Austrians, but there's actually a lot of differences. And it all goes back to the origin of money. And it comes right up to the present day, right to the current Federal Reserve and current monetary policy and outlook by Jay Powell and the Open Market Committee. So I'm going to be talking about things ancient and modern. But believe me, it's all extremely important because the two perspectives are very different in all respects. And so the mainstream economic approach, as I define it, is the dogma or traditional approach in academia that's very widespread. I see it every day. You will see it every day. And hopefully, on the basis of this lecture, you'll be able to recognize the differences. And of course, this mainstream economic approach is also the dominant approach at the Federal Reserve and their outlook on what money is and monetary policy and inflation. So, mainstream economics sees money as simply a numeraire, a kind of marker or chip, really almost like an accounting fiction. So, in their minds, what if prices rise? Well, they don't really see the problem. They don't see the real effects. 2% inflation targeting is an optimality in monetary policy. They don't see any problem with that. They kind of get the hint that rapid price inflation, high levels, is bad, and rapid deflation of the money supply is bad, but they don't really understand the real effects of all inflation. So they can't totally ignore price inflation because of all the pain it means for the average family, you and I, everybody out there in the economy, and all the dislocations that it causes out there in the economy that we see emerging today in banking and in mortgage lending. All of the real things out there are, noticeably problematic, and yet the Fed doesn't really understand that. They generally dismiss the importance. And in fact, this mainstream approach, they defined inflation as rising prices rather than the traditional definition of inflation as an artificial increase in the money supply. So inflating the money supply as a phenomenon and as a force, a destructive force in the economy, the people at the Federal Reserve don't even consider their money printing to be the cause of higher prices. Okay. People at the Federal Reserve do not consider their own monetary policy of printing up money to be the cause of higher prices or really anything else. Now, interestingly, before we get into the nuts and bolts, mainstream economists do go bananas when it comes to deflation or falling prices or falling money supply. Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman, who recently retired from writing a column at the New York Times, called deflation the black hole of economics. So, on the one hand, inflation, no problem. Deflation, an enormous problem of unknown proportions, highly destructive. So mainstream economists have a phobia about deflation, even though regular people out there in the economy love it. When stores put things on their goods on sale, people, love that. They're attracted to that. So I wonder what this dichotomy could mean between the mainstream view and the real world. Could it be that economists make most of their money from government, and government is the biggest debtor in the economy and would be the biggest loser from deflation? Well, I'll let you answer that for yourself. Now, in terms of the origin of money, the emergence of money is really at the heart of the emergence of society and civilization. Money helps overcome the difficulties involved in barter exchange, which is really barter exchange when goods are transacted between families or between individuals. That's really the beginning of social man, when we interact with other groups or other people. And money helps overcome those difficulties by overcoming the age-old problem of the double coincidence of wants. This is an economic phenomenon or situation where two parties each hold an item that the other one wants and are willing to exchange them in acceptable quantities so that both people agree and benefit from the trade. So if I've got a bushel of apples, you've got a bushel of oranges, and we trade an apple for an orange, well, we've made a barter exchange that benefits both of us. Now, in a primitive society where there are very few goods at all, just a few agricultural goods, really, and a few other items, but, barter is relatively easy. But like romance, this is exceedingly difficult and rare in a modern economy. And in contrast to romance, using barter today for all of your exchanges is actually impossible. Money is a good used as the medium of exchange. Here, I'm willing to trade my apples for sardines, even though I hate sardines, because I know a salmon fisherman nearby who would likely trade some of their salmon for some sardines. So I trade my apples for sardines and then trade the sardines for the salmon. So the sardines have acted as a medium of exchange. Now, this is actually the beginning of entrepreneurship. I've made a forward looking trade in hopes of profiting from it. Now, of course, when we look back on primitive exchange, this all presupposes, of course, respect for property and an elementary understanding of law in primitive society, not modern law, but just basic property law. The use of medium of exchange encourages the division of labor and the formation of markets. And markets, in turn, encourage the establishment of a generally accepted medium of exchange, or money. Money is a generally accepted medium of exchange. And once we get markets and everybody sees that, for example, I was using sardines as money, well, that may not be a very good money. So something else like dates or lentils, which has a little more lasting power to it, doesn't smell very quickly, that may become the generally accepted medium of exchange. And in these early times, good monies drive out bad monies over time. And as monies between little groups of societies and markets collide with one another. Now, this theory of the origin and development of money is well established and widely agreed upon in the scientific community. It's a historical deductive theory based on logic rather than evidence. Now, of course, the evidence that does exist seems to support it as well, but this is a theory that emerged in the writings of Richard Cantillon and his essay on the nature of commerce in general, written in 1730. Menger actually had 3 copies of Cantillon's essay in his library, and I think he was a big influence on Carl Menger. So this theory of the origin of money is not only well accepted, but it has important implications for monetary theory and monetary policy, all in favor of a commodity-based money with market forces. Now, the alternative theory here is a state theory of money, sometimes fashioned as a credit theory of money, and it's historically known as the chartalist theory of money. This theory finds that the state created money in the first place. It was just, some idea that some brilliant bureaucrat had that, hey, I think we need something here to make all these trades with. And so, the state invented money. This theory finds that the state created money before anybody else was practicing the use of money. It's kind of like a King Midas fable. Here, the state created paper money to make purchases and then redeemed or extinguished this money when people paid their taxes. The state was creating a unit of account, really, for its purchases and its revenues, which would in turn serve as a medium of exchange between merchants it bought from and the eventual taxpayers making payments. So in this state theory, it's a miracle happens. The state invents money, and it's really a medium of account that it creates that then serves as a medium of exchange. Whereas in the economic theory of money that Menger wrote about so brilliantly, he starts with money emerging as a medium of exchange that has to be the case logically. So he's deducing it from logic to show how a commodity became a medium of exchange. And then when it began trading on a regular basis, it eventually traded in uniform coins. People came up with the idea, well, chunks of metal, for example, chunks of silver were not uniform. So eventually, people invented coins and other uniform units of measure. And then that became a standard of accounting and deferred payments. So, again, both theories are completely different. The state theory is an evidence based theory, supposedly, that often refers to clay tablets and the coining of money. It is at pains, however, to explain how these states ever discovered the idea in the first place prior to seeing it in action. More importantly, it is difficult to imagine how society could ever sufficiently develop in size and complexity in the first place to support a state that might come up with such an idea. Okay, so without money, you're also without entrepreneurship, the division of labor, the emergence of markets, and all the rest. And without all of that, it's hard to imagine a society becoming sufficiently great, economic, and complex enough that they could ever afford a state. So you might have heard of modern monetary theory. It's kind of the rage idea on the socialist left on the internet. And the modern monetary theory is a chartalist theory of money where the state creates and spends money into existence and then extinguishes the money through taxation. Taxation creates a demand for money. Okay, so the state says it's it's going to tax you, and you've got to come up with the money to pay your taxes, and so therefore, people are willing to accept this money that the state has created, paper money usually, in order to get the money, in order to pay the taxes in an elaborate, sort of roundabout fashion. My colleague here at the Mises Institute, Jonathan Newman, has actually very recently gone into the archaeological records. Okay, so he's writing a book right now, or he's editing a book of contributions against this modern monetary theory, which is becoming so popular. And so Jonathan went back into what archaeologists were finding and what they were saying. And he found that the evidence, the empirical evidence for this state theory, this chartalist theory of modern monetary theory, is on very thin ice. It turns out that silver, which Richard Cantillon and Carl Menger focused in on as the original money that was of metallic form. Once you get into the development of metal, the Iron Age and that sort of thing, the Bronze Age, that's where money became a metal, basically. And it turns out that silver was regularly featured in the evidence of these ancient clay tablets. So it wasn't a numeraire. It wasn't just made up. It wasn't a fiction. It was basically a record keeping for transactions that were taking place in the form of silver. So it completely debunks this chartalist state theory of money that modern monetary theory rests itself on. And this, I would say, confirms the economic theory of the origin of money as a commodity, in this case, silver, and eventually silver coins. This has important implications for monetary theory and monetary policy. In short, money should be a commodity or commodities, and that monetary policy should follow the laws of supply and demand, economic forces that determine the quantity and purchasing power of the monetary commodity, not some state authority. Now, even up until modern times, the last 100 years or so, there was something called the classical dichotomy in economics. And that is a real distinction, a really hardcore distinction in economics between real values in the economy, which were separate and independent from nominal values. And of course, this draws our attention back to the divide between mainstream economists who see little problem with inflation or changing the money supply, and Austrian economists who see it as really the most disruptive force in the economy that impacts and distorts prices, incomes, production patterns, investment patterns, and the distribution of wealth. Okay. So real values are like wages, interests, investment, etc., that are grounded in real quantities and real factors, irrespective of price tags. So what we're talking about with real, we're talking on the basis of supply and demand and the actual quantities, the purchasing power that's really involved. And in contrast, nominal values are just a function of the quantity of money units. And of course, I'm sure you've all heard of the simple quantity theory of money. And of course, everybody accepts the basic idea of the quantity theory that if you increase the quantity of money, that prices will rise. But we're going to see, of course, that the theory, as it gets into monetary theory and the business cycle theory, is very problematic. And that's why we sometimes refer to this simple quantity theory of money as the naive quantity theory of money. And again, in this naive view, changes in the money supply only impact nominal values. They don't disturb or change real values in the economy. They don't change relative prices. Money is just neutral. It's like a veil of ignorance in the economy. And this is something that Richard Cantillon in 1730, his whole essay really dispels that notion. He actually critiqued that naive quantity theory as it existed at the time. Now, the quantity theory still was a breakthrough. I mean, it goes back a long time. It was certainly prominent as early as the Middle Ages and very important after the Spanish conquest in the New World. People were well aware that the increases in the quantity of money that was being taken back from the Americas, silver and gold, led to higher prices throughout the economy, first in Spain, but then throughout Europe. So all this quantity coming in led to higher prices. Everybody knew that. So everybody kind of understood that naive quantity theory. And John Locke, the philosopher, the English philosopher, brought the naive view of the quantity theory to the English speaking world. You know, if you double the supply of money, all prices in the economy will likewise double. And that's what Richard Cantillon in his essay, that's what he critiqued. He said that never works out. Even if you doubled the money supply, that's not going to double all prices. It's not going to double, some kind of average calculation of all prices. We don't know what it's going to do to relative prices or the so-called price level. But we do know it's going to have important changes. And ultimately, the one thing you want to keep your eye open for as your study of economics and markets continues Richard Cantillon, one of his best known contributions is called the Cantillon effect. And the Cantillon effect is the impact of increasing the money supply on particular people's income, particular demands in the economy, and then how it affects production and investment in the economy. So the Cantillon effect is kind of like an important cog in the Austrian business cycle theory. So that's something you're going to want to study. And so the Cantillon effect starts right here in the real distortions that an increase in the money supply will create in an economy. And because we know that money doesn't come down into the economy by the Federal Reserve helicopters. They don't give everybody an equal share of the new money. It comes in a particular point in time in a particular place. It comes into the New York credit markets, for example, from the New York Federal Reserve Bank. And it comes into the banking sector. And so Cantillon recognized that it was really these real world considerations that really mattered and had an effect. Before we get to that, though, I would want to point out another kind of standout contribution in the English speaking world. Generally speaking, the Spanish and Italians and French and others were further ahead than the English, and that was Gresham's Law, which was named after Thomas Gresham, who was an advisor to the English government. And it's basically a government policy problem. When a government sets a price control between two different monies, it's going to eventually lead to shortages and surpluses. So, for example, gold was used primarily in large transactions and international trade, whereas silver was used in day-to-day commerce. Now, if governments, as they're wont to do, they wanted to set a legal ratio or price control between gold and silver. And this would, of course, eventually cause shortages and surpluses, notably shortages, where one money would be driven out of circulation almost completely, the one that was undervalued by the government, and forced everybody to use the overvalued money. And so the simplified version of Gresham's Law is bad money drives out good money. And of course, on the surface of that, anybody who's a free market person is going to recoil at that bad money drives out good money, that the market wants bad money and it doesn't want good money. But of course, Gresham's Law hinges on the idea of a price control where the government sets the price of gold versus silver. And a really good example of this is when the United States, stopped minting its coinage in silver in 1964. Gresham's Law soon saw fit that all of the old silver coins, which were relatively undervalued by the government, all of a sudden they were all out of circulation. And only the new fakey clad coins, which didn't have silver, those were really overvalued by the government relative to the silver. And so, all of the silver fled circulation. The good money left and the bad money remained. But that's only because the government valued a quarter, whether it was silver or fake. Today, a silver quarter, and there's still tons of them around. Not many of them are in circulation. Very few are in circulation, but a silver quarter today, without any numismatic value, or even if it was all dirty and beat up, would equal about 25 modern quarters, or around $6. So the bad clad quarters drove the good silver quarters out of circulation. Again, it just shows you what happens when government gets involved. The more involved government gets involved with money, the worse things tend to turn out. In fact, Gresham's law, I did a podcast on this. The reason most owners of Bitcoin, and again, there's not a government ratio between dollars and Bitcoins, obviously. Bitcoin is free to circulate in the market. But the reason most owners of Bitcoin do not use them for purchases is related to Gresham's law, because Bitcoins are generally appreciated in value while the dollar is depreciating. So as a result, if people have both Bitcoin and dollars, which is generally the case, they're going to spend their dollars and hold on to their Bitcoin. Now, the big breakthrough in this classical dichotomy, this fake distinction in money and the real economy, came with Ludwig von Mises's book, The Theory of Money and Credit. And like Cantillon and Menger, you can do a search of Ludwig von Mises, Theory of Money and Credit, PDF, and you'll be able to download a free PDF copy of all this stuff from the Mises Institute webpage. But just Google it and it'll come up. Mises was building on Menger's theory of the origin of money. He also knew from Menger that all economic values are based on individual subjective valuations, not on some kind of mechanical formula of the quantity theory. Mises posited that the economic value of money is determined by individual choices based in part on the objective value of money's purchasing power. So Mises said that people held money based on its current purchasing power, or its purchasing power in the very recent past. And then some scholars charged Mises with circular reasoning, that the subjective value that individuals have of money today was based on the objective value of money in the previous period. So how could that be a good grounding for the value of money? Well, Mises countered with the regression theorem, which says that yes, the value today is in part based on the objective value yesterday, but this just works itself backward in time until you get to the point where money was valued strictly as a commodity before it was adopted for use as a money. So there is a real basis of money's value on a day-to-day basis as you go backwards and backwards in time until you get to the point where that money, like gold or silver, was simply valued for itself as a commodity, not as money at all. And importantly, this means that commodity money actually has two sources of demand. It's demand for its use as a medium of exchange, and it's demand for its use as a commodity. And of course, some scholars have charged that Bitcoin can never be money because it never was a commodity. But this really misses the point. Mises was trying to provide an explanation that bridged this gap between real and nominal, between micro and between macro, and the emergence of money as Menger taught, as it being subjectively determined. And Mises's contribution really remained true to Menger's foundations and contributions. So money emerged as a commodity in trade, but it doesn't really matter that Bitcoin is not a commodity because money has already emerged. We all know the function of money. We all know what money can do. So it's not like we have to invent money. Now, Bitcoin was invented, but also fiat money was invented, and that didn't stop fiat money from serving as a currency. So the regression theorem is not really a true critique of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies because the regression theorem was not meant to be that kind of defining criticism. Now, I want to get to a couple of things. I'm going to try to get all this done in time and have time for some questions. But one thing that I think is very important in today's marketplace, I mean, the theory here is that as money is injected in the economy, it goes into the hands of certain individuals. They have excess purchasing power. But let's take it back here for a moment to Mises's theory about progressive inflation or progressive price inflation. And Mises said that there were 3 stages of price inflation. In the first stage, the early stage, is when the government is increasing the supply of money beyond what the market would typically do. And in this first stage, people simply accept this increased money supply the same way they would if we were on the gold standard and there were a lot of new gold discoveries. Okay, people just accept the fact that there's more money around and they accumulate new money. Their demand to hold money increases with the increased supply. Okay, so their demand for holding money is neutral with respect to, in other words, it doesn't really cause individuals to behave differently during this first stage when they accept and accumulate, adjust their new demand to the supply, and there's no upward price inflation. Okay, so the second stage is where people understand that prices are beginning to rise and that money is actually losing its purchasing power over time. Okay, so the government has not just increased the supply of money, but it's increasing the supply of money on a regular, ongoing basis. And this is causing prices to rise, and it's causing the money unit to lose purchasing power over time. So in this second stage, they don't accept the new supply. They don't want to accumulate more money. So their demand is not accommodative in this second stage. They're much more willing to spend the new money rather than to hold the new money, maybe in terms of savings. Okay, and so this is the transition. Step 2 or stage 2 is the transition step in inflation, where price inflation starts to rise, where people become attuned to the new condition. Stage 3 is where people understand that monetary policy is now increasing the money supply in an ongoing basis, maybe on an increasing basis over time, and decreasing the purchasing power of money on an ongoing basis. And so now people actually reduce their demand to hold money, which means they try to spend their money, they try to hold lower money balances. Of course, somebody's got to hold all the money. I mean, that's the thing about money is it's being held 100% across the economy. So everybody is trying to spend their money and decrease their monetary balances in this stage three. And this is the decrease in the demand for money. So money begins to depreciate even faster. And it's in this stage three that behavior changes and becomes problematic. And we saw this stage three start to open up after COVID, after the Fed flooded the economy with $5 trillion into the US economy. Of course, other central banks did the same thing. And, and then price inflation instead of 2% was 3%. And then before we knew it, it was 9%. And people started, dropping their accumulated cash and they started spending it rather quickly. And the Fed had to act and raise interest rates dramatically as a consequence. And so Mises explains, this process of inflation, why sometimes increases in the money supply don't result in increases in prices generally or a decrease in the purchasing power, and where sometimes the increase in prices and the decrease in purchasing power seems to exceed the mechanical amount of money that the central bank is injecting. Okay. Money is, valued subjectively, as Menger taught, just like anything else. And Mises is explaining that, that mechanical view of the quantity theory, it's not a real reflection of the real world. And so that's very, very valuable. And I think it's going to be very, very valuable moving forward as, the Fed and other central banks, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan. I mean, these banks are wetting their pants right now, their policy pants right now, because they don't know really what to do. They're faced with these huge uh, budget deficits of the government and borrowing requirements. So the governments want them to monetize the debt. But the problem with that is that monetization, everybody's catching on to that, and interest rates are rising. Interest rates are rising in the UK on their long-term bonds. Interest rates in Japan are rising. They're at historical all-time highs. In Japan, they're having a hard time selling this government debt, and the central banks just can't step in with their magic and wish everything away without the currency losing a lot of value. So people are attuned. Real people are attuned to what's going on, and it all reflects the realistic approach that Menger started, Mises built on, Hayek built on, Rothbard built on, about real money and real monetary theory and real monetary policy. We're right in the thick of it right now, today, this week, with Chairman Powell and all of that. So we're right in the middle of it. And of course, this is not a lecture on the business cycle, but of course, that's the next step, because, from the days of Richard Cantion's essay to the present, Austrians have been paying a whole heck of a lot of attention to, government injecting money where are they injecting it? What impact is that having on relative prices, particularly, um, the interest rate, and that affects credit markets, it affects investment, and in the Austrian macro model, it particularly affects investment in what von Bavarick called more roundabout means of production. And in today's terminology, it refers to advanced technology. And advanced technology today is artificial intelligence. So all of this fits together extremely well. And I think it reflects very, very badly on the mainstream view of money, from its origin on up to the present. It really makes it look extremely ignorant. Well, it's one of those things. Is it ignorance or is it corruption? We don't really know. We don't want to pick fights or cast aspersions, but it's one or the other. And I think that's what Menger sought to do. He understood miraculously, um, the fundamental problems of economic theory that existed in the classical school of economics, and he really set us on the right methodological path. And Menger's path was so astonishing that when young socialist college students like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek read his book, they instantly became free market types, and they used Menger's methodology to extend and create a great body of theoretical work. And it's that work that stands in complete contrast to what, the existing dogma of mainstream economics advances. And with that, I will stop and maybe take a couple questions. Let's see.
Yes. Can you hear us, Mark?
Yeah. Yes,
All
sir.
right. Well, thank you for the lecture. That was very insightful. Um, Anyone have some questions? Touched on the coin, the quarter going from silver to the bad money today at 64, but you didn't touch on Nixon taking off the dollar being backed by gold in 71. Is that more important? The coin being, you know what I mean? Is there, or is it the same importance, or can I hear more about the dollar being backed by gold and that being changed in 71, the relationship between the flooding of money in the government to society because of that?
Could could you repeat the question, please?
Can I know more about the importance of Nixon taking the dollar off of being backed by gold in 71 and the relationship with that and to the society and how we use money or how they print money or how the Federal Reserve goes about money?
Yeah, I mean, going off the gold standard, if I understood the question completely, going off the gold standard in 1971, of course, broke the connection with the commodity of gold, and that kept things wow, kept things tied to the market forces, and it prevented our central bank and other central banks from increasing the money supply at very, very high rates, and also discouraged them from um, having an interest rate policy that was at odds with market interest rates. And so the gold standard, it, that existed under Bretton Woods was not a good gold standard. It was a managed gold standard. It was one in which market forces were, you know, buffered. And so it wasn't great, but it was something. And going off of that, of course, we've seen not just the central banks um, erratic monetary policy, following political factors, but we've also seen in the United States a huge expansion in the amount of borrowing that took place by the government. And of course, that is coming home to roost. And another consequence of that was that the United States ran enormous trade deficits. Prior to 1971, if the United States had a trade deficit, then gold would flow out of the country and keep that in balance. So we've created two massive historical imbalances in the US economy, but of course, that means imbalances in the entire global economy. So, yeah, I mean, that's really what we're looking at straight on dead away right now, is that very problem that even the Bretton Woods system kept government planners, bureaucrats, technocrats, it kept their hands tied to a certain extent, and kept monetary policy in some form of balance. I saw another question.
Hi, we have a question in Zoom from Jeff Crawford. He
And I
asks,
don't see it up there.
it's okay, I'm gonna read it to you. He's asking, is quantitative
Oh, wait a
easing
second. Is quantitative easing, tightening, or the setting of interest rates more important to causing inflation? Well, those are the policies that are designed, those are the targets that are established. But quantitative easing and tightening basically means changing the quantity of money. Okay, so quantitative easing meant that the Fed was buying up government debt and mortgage-backed securities in the trillions of dollars. And the Fed itself thinks that it's adjusting the price of money, the interest rate, and they don't think that the money that they're creating or destroying really is the main event. They think that their control of the interest rate is really the main event. That's why they're not worried about inflation as seen as changing the money supply. So it's kind of a subterfuge where they're referring to interest rate policies, but of course, interest rate policies are conducted by their purchases and sale of government debt, which is the raw material for the banking system to increase the supply of money. Now, I didn't get into that whole process of the banking system because the banking system is a separate topic and lecture, as is the business cycle. So I didn't really go into it in a great deal of detail, but that's really a great question because it gets into the mindset of these central bankers that they think they're just adjusting the price. Like, that they're working at a gas station and they change the price of gasoline as it appears on the sign out front. But ultimately, they're having an effect on quantity, and that's what's having an effect in the real economy. And I got another question here. Would you say what happened in Zimbabwe, where the government introduced the US dollar into circulation against the local currency, is the fulfillment of Gresham's law? Yes. When, currency boards and currency substitutions, the US dollar, Americans think of it as horrible and deranged and exploitive and so on and so forth, inflationary, but it's really just the least dirty shirt in the closet as far as currencies are concerned. And a lot of other currencies are much worse, including in Zimbabwe, which experienced a hyperinflation. And so Steve Hanke is a big name, a big deal in our school because he's gone around and showed these inflationary and hyperinflationary economies that you either have to stop printing money or you have to substitute a better currency for the one you're using, or a currency board, which is very similar to that, where you adopt a relatively stable currency like the US dollar rather than your local currency, which has been highly inflationary or has lost all of its value. So in those circumstances, initially people will keep the dollars and spend the Zimbabwe dollars, but the Zimbabwe dollars will become very quickly worthless and drop out of circulation. So yeah, we see the ghost of Gresham, in monetary policy throughout history and around the world. But the Gresham's law almost always applies to a case where the government has set a very specific price ratio between gold and silver. And if your economy is used to using gold and silver, and people are doing their day-to-day transactions in silver coins, and then all of a sudden the silver flows out because of some bonehead government policy, that's really dramatic because gold coins are not good substitutes for silver coins. And if people find it profitable to not spend the silver or to export the silver, which very often happened in the past, that can have a very bad problem, be a very difficult problem to face in those early emerging economies. Okay, well, thank you all very much. I hope you have a good day, and it's been a lot of fun for me, and good luck with your studies.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you for joining the Menger Institute, and we would like to see more of you in the future. Thank you.